Thank you, Dr. Shen. I appreciate that. Wonderful speakers, and want to thank Dr. Wolf and especially all the organizers for this really impressive lineup of speakers. I am a professor of OBGYN in the Department of OBGYN and Women's Health at the University of Minnesota, and currently the Associate Director of Research for the Masonic Cancer Center here. Dr. Wolf previously mentioned some of my disclosures. And really, what I want to introduce is our next session that's going to focus on institutional review boards, so our IRBs and other research oversight bodies. Our speakers, Dr. Barbara Beer and Professor Holly Fernandez Lynch, are leading experts really in this area. So I remind you that each speaker will present for about 20 minutes, and then we're going to turn to audience questions. So you can post your questions in the Q&A as you did previously before and upvote those questions and really try to direct these questions to which speaker you would like an answer from. So our first speaker is Dr. Barbara Beer. She is the faculty director of the Multi-Regional Clinical Trials Center at Brigham and Women's Hospital at Harvard. She's professor of medicine at Harvard Medical School and Brigham and Women's Hospital there, as well as a hematologist oncologist, and currently the director of the SMART IRB, as well as director of the Regulatory Foundation's Ethics and Law Program of the Harvard Clinical and Translational Science Center. She remains a faculty member in the Center for Bioethics at Harvard Medical School, and affiliate faculty member in the Petrie-Flom Center for Health Law, Policy, Biotechnology, and Bioethics at Harvard. She previously served as the chair of the Secretary's Advisory Committee for Human Research Protections for the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, as well as a member of the National Academy's Science Committee on Science, Technology, and Law. She is on the board of directors for the Association for Accreditation of Human Research Protections Program and for Public Responsibility in Medicine Research. So a lot of words, a lot of important titles. And so I welcome Dr. Beer. She has no relevant disclosures to this presentation.
Thank you, Melissa. It is a great pleasure to be here and to follow outstanding presentations and really setting the stage for us in a most wonderful way, a sobering way, I'll say. And our remit today is to really focus on clinical research and research ethics when it involves humans. And then we bring in the role of IRBs, institutional review boards, and the issues surrounding them. My disclaimer is that I am here as my own person and I don't represent any other organization. The center is supported by voluntary contributions, which are listed, as well as by grants. And I think all of the pieces of my relevant disclosures have been mentioned. None of them are financial. So today I was asked to sort of set the stage for ethics review in the setting of clinical research and to do that efficiently in order to bring the audience up to speed as to what they are and where these holes are and how did we get here, and then to talk about the gaps and opportunities. I will say that I'll do background in about one sentence and history in two in order to have time to talk about the IRB remit, current landscape, regulations, compliance ethics, and the real distance between those two that we currently experience but need not, and then gaps in research oversight. I will say that the focus will be on the US, largely on regulations of HHS and FDA. That's not to discount other regulations like DOD and others, but just to keep it focused. And largely medical research, not research in the business schools or and largely medical. So, it's important to note that unethical research is not new. It's been going on as long as research has been going on. Whether we knew it or not, we don't know. A transformative moment came early, probably in the 1950s and then 60s with Beecher's publication, Henry Beecher's publication in the New England Journal, which disclosed and sort of gave 22 unethical examples of 22 unethical clinical trials where there was inadequate disclosure, inadequate consent, and problematic goals. The Nuremberg trials, I think everybody is familiar with. Untreated syphilis study of Tuskegee. And there are many, many others, both known and unknown. And that set the stage for how our ethics oversight body came about. It came about through a history of abuse and inappropriate consent and inappropriate or inadequate information, and gave the role of protector of the research environment um, to the ethics committees. That was canonized in the Nuremberg Code and the Declaration of Helsinki, National Research Act in 1974. And then probably what we know best in America is the Belmont Report, which gave us the ethical frame for oversight, which spoke to three domains of responsibility: interacting and not standing alone, respect for persons, autonomy and consent, beneficence, thou shalt do no harm, and non-maleficence, and justice, which is, sort of appropriate selection of participants. Those are complicated, really well-formed, and I have to say, for somebody who's been doing this forever, I still read the Belmont Report every year and see new things in it, depending on the sort of surround sound here. Regulations followed. I'll talk about that briefly, but the challenge, as you think about it, is that it's easy to have and give ethical pronouncements, but it's very challenging to apply those to real world settings. One can say pretty readily that, healthcare is a right, but what does that mean? And how do you apply it? And where do you set the limits? Healthcare is a right. To what extent? All of the details of these kinds of things need to be thought about in the setting in which you're addressing it. So what is right in one setting may not be necessarily right in another. And that is particularly true in clinical research, where one sees situations differently, settings different, culture different, questions different, risks different, etc. So that requires an analysis. And that decision making as to what's acceptable or not requires judgment and an appreciation of inherent tensions and complexities and an ability to balance those. And it's true that the regulations could not really focus on that, how do you be a good judge? How do you define that balance? And therefore, they focus more on process with very general terms for what should be happening. The introduction of the institutional review of research, the creation of IRBs, later called IRBs when it was in 1966, when the U.S. Surgeon General, following Beecher and several other reports of concern, required institutional review of human subjects research. The IRB is an administrative body that protects the rights, welfare, and safety of human participants involved in research. Initially, it was envisioned as a local and an institutional committee to foster investigator engagement, understand local context, understand the patient population or participant population. You'll see that that's evolved. What's critical here, I think, is that in the early days, there was very much this local context of educational role for the IRBs and engaged role for the IRBs. And just as Person said that that journals, by the time we see it in journals, the research is done. Now we hear by the time we get it to the IRB, it's already planned. All we have to do is say, can it go forward? we don't have a chance to engage with the investigators to see and help plan an ethical or a better ethical set of questions. So the IRBs review, approve, and monitor research studies to ensure that they adhere to ethical standards and federal regulations. But the regulations really speak to define membership, rules, expectations, regulations, what the minutes have to say, how many people can be on it, et cetera. And the times that they talk about, what else it does is relatively small. The US FDA parallels the HHS common rule to a great extent, not entirely. There are some differences. And in most settings, IRB review and approval are obligate steps prior to the initiation of research. That's true for university research in general, and gives us the opportunity, were we to empower IRBs with that kind of strength and true north, to really provide that ethical oversight. How many IRBs are there in the US? Approximately 3,500, according to the OHRP database. Now, some institutions register multiple IRBs. Some institutions have an FWA without an IRB, and they rely on an external IRB. Those are fewer. So the estimate is there are about 2,800 or so institutions that are registering these IRBs. It's an incredibly complex pattern of IRBs and hard to get everyone rowing in the same direction. 249 organizations are accredited by the Association for Accreditation of Human Research Protection Programs, which really does ensure that the processes and policies are in place. Interesting, from the time of, 70 years ago or so, 60 years ago, there's been a growth of independent and more often commercial independent and commercial IRBs. There are a few independent nonprofit IRBs. And they review the supermajority of industry-sponsored trials. These are single IRBs that would do the review across the entire study. They are efficient, they're predictable, they are costly for the institutions. For industry, cost is less of a factor, and it's easy to see why. The efficiency and predictability is there. Importantly, 92% of drug trials sponsored by pharma are reviewed by two companies, WCG Clinical and Advara. And it's estimated that 50% of all research reviewed by IRBs are reviewed by commercial IRBs, for-profit IRBs. Approximately, less than a decade ago, the NIH and Common Rule required single IRB of multi-site studies. So now we see that the number of registered IRB has decreased as reliance has grown. And reliance is the ability of any any institution to rely on any IRB that holds an FWA. That's true for all NIH-supported and conducted research and anything that falls under the Common Rule. And that would give, theoretically, that single IRB significant sort of gravitas to change or to engage in conversation about how that trial or research should be ongoing. What you'll see is that that is often challenging because there is no engagement earlier on, and you feel like you're going to undo the work and the protocol that is otherwise acceptable in order to improve it. And there's challenging because IRBs are feeling beaten up all the time. The regulations are appropriately broad. Minimize risk. The benefit should be greater than risk in the assessment. There should be an understandable consent in plain language, understandable to the participant, or the consent can be waived under certain conditions. There is safety monitoring, protections of vulnerable populations, but largely the regulations, as I mentioned, focused on process, things like required membership, no less than 5. But the IRB is supposed to represent the population who is to undergo and who has the condition. And it would be hard to say that one can do that in 5 members. They must have written procedures, reporting requirements, their prescribed elements of consent, and that leads, where's my, to a perfect storm, where we're expecting our IRBs to provide the kind of considered, thoughtful, ethical guidance to the study, but yet the only regulations that are in place are very much sort of minimal, process-driven requirements. So even the prescribed elements of consent, some very reasonable, but some don't apply in all research, yet you have to introduce them. So that has led to an evolution, since compliance and enforcement is based on the regulations, to saying we can't let this go without making sure that all those requirements are done, which I call the checklist culture. Do you have a checklist? We were asked by WHO to develop a research ethics checklist, and we divided it into 11 domains and had sort of the substantive questions that you should be asked. It ended up to be that you should ask, not answer, but you should ask and consider in any trial. This is for interventional trials. And it ended up to be 9 or 10 pages. They said, can you make it a single page with a checklist box? Well, it doesn't compute. And this is the challenge where we're focusing in part on institutional compliance with the regulations, as the institutions are. And in many ways, we're using the informed consent to anticipate liability, curtail the impact, and look at institutional protections. So the result is here, in my opinion, is both over and under regulation, over interpretation and over regulation. In general, the work of the IRBs is not risk proportionate, which is the probability by the magnitude of risk. So that, if it's a high impact but low numbers of times, that's one thing. But if it occurs very frequently but is less significant, that is another. But there's an outside focus on minimal risk and data-only research, focusing on things such which may not be the most important, like privacy and security. Privacy and confidentiality is critically important. In data-only research, equally important is the security of that data and the protection from download. So significant time and resources are spent on smaller and often theoretical risks, less on sort of scientific review and statistical analysis. We saw during COVID that many of the interventional trials did not enroll sufficient numbers of patients to be useful. We spend a lot of time on social and behavioral research, survey research with no or minimal risk queries, and yet we review the entire survey itself to see if it is acceptable. One can see that there are reasons for this under certain circumstances, but if that is at the cost of higher risk, more complex trials, new things, that's a challenge. And we focus on protections rather than inclusion. As we've seen this protective attitude come down, we really believe that it is at a cost of not including people that should be invited to participate in the trial, and importantly, reflect the population that has the condition or is likely to have the condition. There's a very broad definition of vulnerability, such as economically and educationally disadvantaged persons. and not an insufficient appreciation that vulnerability is evolving and organic or dynamic over time. Something that the Declaration of Helsinki got right, in my opinion, and that our regulations don't. And many regulatory flexibilities that exist are not explored or not utilized. Under-regulation is, I think, an important consideration. And you'll see I'm not going to argue for more regulation, but I want to understand what huge holes there are in our oversight at the moment. So first, clinical research, as I'm defining it, is biological, behavioral, psychological, and sociological investigations intended to collect and analyze non-public information about individuals or groups for the purpose of generating generalizable knowledge. The common rule, however, applies only to research funded or conducted by the US government. The FDA rules apply to all clinical investigations involving human subjects, particularly those testing products regulated by the FDA, such as drugs, medical devices, and biologics, or intended to be used by them. Now, institutions, universities can opt to follow the federal regulations for all research, but they need not. And it also means that the research that is not covered in or performed in universities, colleges, medical centers, but rather elsewhere, we don't have any visibility into what those processes are. So all for-profit company research not directed towards a medical claim can go without oversight by an IRB. Much of it does have an IRB, but as I said, that's problematic. Academic community or other research not funded by the US government can escape review, although most of us apply it. And research based on anonymized data and de-identified if one can waive consent. What don't we look at? So first, we don't look at the impact of research on society and communities. We don't look at third-party risks. What are the risks to, family members or society or insular, discrete communities or participants in the surround of an environment? Not participants, all people in the surround of a research environment. Research using de-identified, anonymized, or publicly available data, as I mentioned, except if the data collection itself involves direct interaction with the research participant. But even then, one can de-identify or anonymize it and use it subsequently. Research defined as QA/QI, quality assurance, quality improvement. And the line between research and QA/QI when you're doing, A/B trials is hard at times to differentiate. So that there's a lot of work that gets done under the guise of QA/QI that in other settings might be called research. There's downstream data use, which the participants may or may not know about. There's often a mention of future research, but participants may not know what that future research will be. And some ethical challenges with that, such as when you cannot join an active, potentially beneficial trial unless you also agree to the future use of your data. There's non-clinical digital research, algorithmic validity, bias, and post-deployment governance, for which we don't have any working guidelines from the government or regulations. Public health research with an impact on individuals or communities, data security, as I mentioned. And then there's, really lacking an ethical dialogue on new methodologies. And as Christine said earlier, our ability to have that community, to have that ethical dialogue is now challenging. There are specific considerations that are not mentioned in the regulations. So representativeness in clinical trials, beyond this idea of equitable selection, there's no call necessarily that the clinical trials be representative of the of the population affected by the disease. There are certain things that we could do in regulation or in policy that would really enable representation that I think would be um, proportionate regulation to representation to the condition under study that I think would be very helpful to increasing access to those clinical trials. If we required simply specificity and written justification for eligibility criteria, you'd see the numbers of potential enrollees go up. Language accessibility, right now we permit things to say you must be, speak or understand English in the US. Uh, and that's one thing if you're looking at, speech development. If it's another if you're looking at oncology trials. Digital access and support. Are we encouraging by some of the methods that we use, particularly in say decentralized clinical trials, creating a different minority, those that don't have access to digital services, internet, and the hardware.
Dr. Vera, I think we have to get moving on to our next presentation. So if you want to wrap up yours, that would
Yes,
be
I will.
fabulous. That's okay. Thank you.
The last one. Yeah. There's a required community partnership, research-related injury, post-trial access to medicines, participant rights to access their individual data, clarity on equivalent protections, etc. So, as my last slide, I'll say, I think that we've interpreted regulations to translate to must and must translate to compliance. We need to recenter the ethical deliberation with investigators broadly defined in communities, potential participants in the public. And when does a patient have a right to their own assessment of benefits and risks, particularly, for instance, in N-of-1 trials as a good example. And IRBs must evolve from a must to collaborative considerations, recommendations, and education. From a must to what you could do, should do, or might do. We have to face the challenge of de-identification not being anymore a common grounding for some of our decisions. And I think principally we need to stand together to address these issues. So with that, sorry for taking extra time. On to Holly.
Thank you. Wonderful. So I appreciate that. We'll save our questions for the end. I'd like to invite our next speaker, who is Professor Holly Fernandez Lynch, who is an associate professor of medical ethics in the Department of Medical Ethics and Health Policy at the University of Pennsylvania Perelman School of Medicine. She is a secondary appointment as Associate Professor of Law at the University of Pennsylvania Carey Law School. She's founder and co-chair of the Consortium to Advance Effective Research Ethics Oversight, a collaborative effort established in 2018 to understand, evaluate, and really improve IRB quality and effectiveness. She served as a member of the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services Secretary's Advisory Committee on Human Research Protections from 2014 to 2019 and is currently board president of the American Society of Law, Medicine, and Ethics. She's an advisor to Cranara and in the past had a speaker relationship with Lilly. So I'd like to welcome her here today. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Melissa. And I'm so pleased to be part of this important discussion today. I'm going to pick up where Barbara left off and actually where Christine left off as well, thinking about the various challenges facing research institutions today and how those influence IRBs that are responsible for overseeing research. But especially at Susan's request, I'm going to try to identify positive opportunities or at least concrete opportunities to try to make lemonade out of lemons wherever we can. Melissa did this for me, going through some of my disclosures there, so I can move quickly on to just kind of making sure that we're all on the same page here. I'm thrilled to see how many participants there are online. Might be a little bit overwhelming if we were all in person together to see you standing in the audience. But I know people are coming to this from different parts of the research enterprise. Barbara walked us through some of the history of how we got to the type of research ethics oversight that we have today through IRBs. But if you ask the basic question, right, why do we need independent research ethics oversight? It's because researchers have an inherent conflict of interest. This does not mean they are bad people, right? What it means is they are trying to answer their research question. And sometimes answering the research question is going to require subjecting the research participants to burdens for the benefit of others, right? And so it's important to have somebody who's not involved with the research help evaluate the risks and benefits and make sure that those risks are minimized, because it might not always be possible for the researchers themselves to do that well. The core function of the IRB is to protect research participant rights and welfare. But whenever I say that, I'll add the flip side, right? They also have an important responsibility to not inhibit ethical research, right? They need to protect participants while promoting high quality ethical research. So the concerns and complaints that we often hear about IRBs getting in the way of good research are really problematic, and we need to find a way for them to protect participants while not standing in the way of good research. Barbara walked through the kind of different flavors of IRBs, right? We have commercial IRBs of different stripes. We have the more kind of traditional university IRBs. And I'm happy in the Q&A to kind of talk through some of the pros and cons of both models. But for now, I'll just flag that they both have cons, and they both have things that suggest they are beneficial to engage with. And then, many of you I'm seeing even in the Q&A have concerns about how IRBs engage in research oversight, concerns about being too burdensome, sometimes concerns about making research worse because there's sometimes a lack of expertise. And all of the types of new research that are coming on the scene that Christine mentioned raise, I think, important challenges to make sure that we have the right kind of expertise sitting on our boards. So that was just kind of to set the stage for some of the challenges, and we're going to go into more detail. I want to spend probably about half of my time walking through some deep challenges facing IRBs, which is trying to get the public to understand why they are important. And it's actually harder than it might sound. And then I want to talk about some opportunities that we might be able to build trust based on IRB oversight of research. I'm going to pick up the baton on some of the things that Christine mentioned about federal science policy chaos and how those particularly affect IRB oversight. And then I'll end with a brief discussion about emerging issues arising in how IRBs might use AI. So the key question, right, I've already laid out that independent oversight of research is widely accepted in basically every global statement of research ethics as kind of the central requirement, right? Research is not ethical if we are missing independent oversight. It makes sense, right, for the conflict of interest reasons that I mentioned. It makes sense for the historically concerning examples that we know of and that we don't, that Barbara mentioned. And so we've built up this model of IRB oversight or similar versions of it around the globe, but it is really hard to know whether it works, to be able to point empirically to success and to say, look, the research is made better by virtue of having this type of oversight. And I'll talk a little bit more about why it is so hard to know that it works empirically. But the challenge of not having a reliable way to answer that question is it inhibits our ability to do the various things that you see on this list. So if we knew, right, this is what it means for IRBs to work, then we would be able to say, oh, these are threats that are going to inhibit IRB's ability to do a good job. Or, oh, that IRB is doing things this way. That raises concerns about whether they're going to be able to achieve the ethical outcomes that they were designed to achieve. We also, without being able to point reliably to markers of success, have difficulty determining whether we're giving IRBs enough resources. So if you talk to anybody in the IRB world, they will say we are under-resourced, but how to get the people who are allocating resources to understand kind of the disconnect, that would be much easier if we were able to have reliable markers of success. And then I want to spend some more time talking about this as we go. When we don't know how to reliably measure success, it becomes very difficult to explain why IRBs are so important and what the consequences are of IRB failure, unless you have really egregious missteps, right? These kind of historical failures that we're all aware of. So let's just kind of lay out the fact that IRBs inevitably entail costs. Right? They require resources from institutions and sponsors, and inevitably they are going to cause some delay. And I think it's important to say this out loud. IRBs are actually supposed to slow down research, right? The question is, how much are they supposed to slow it down? And what I mean by that is you have to draft your protocol and give this outside body of independent, experts your protocol, right? And so they can evaluate things, and you can't pass go until they say it's okay. Now, there's lots of exceptions, right? But in general, that's the model that we are working from. The fact that you have to wait for their review, right, means you can't just proceed. There's going to be some inevitable delay. And the idea was to say to investigators, you have to demonstrate that you're meeting all of these ethical criteria. Okay, but of course, right, that causes some frustration. So we've got the resource burden, we've got the delay burden, but the model, right, is that those costs are outweighed by the benefits, right? That IRBs are going to successfully protect participants in various ways, that they're going to be able to support and advance high quality ethical research. And then these bottom two are a little bit fuzzier, but they can help build a culture of ethics within research institutions to say this is the standard that we are going to hold each other to. And if they are doing a good job, ideally we'll be able to avoid unethical research, and that ought to be able to promote trust in the research enterprise. It's a bit more attenuated, of course, to be able to attribute that to IRB oversight. But these are the anticipated benefits of this model. The problem is it's really easy to get evidence about IRB costs. We have lots of empirical evidence about inconsistency in how boards review research and apply regulations, concerns about redundancy, which is how we got to single IRB review requirements. Barbara mentioned this kind of checkbox model, right, where we're really focused on kind of tinkering around the edges rather than focusing our attention on the most important aspects of ethical research. Lots of empirical concerns about whether IRBs have appropriate expertise, whether they're too conservative, and whether they appropriately justify their decisions, right? And I could go on and on. It's easy because you can measure the costs that you see. The evaluation of IRB benefits is much more difficult. And the reasons are many and varied, right? But the most important one is, even though we know in general what the IRB is supposed to achieve, right? Protecting participants, advancing ethical research, it can be very hard to operationalize those outcomes into clear definitions that most of us would agree upon. And without clear definitions, it's hard to have measures. So just to give you one single example, if we said, look, IRBs have to make sure that there is adequate informed consent. What does adequate mean, right? Obviously, you have to follow the regulatory requirements, but you also need to make sure that you are aligning consent with all of the empirical evidence around what makes consent understandable to people, right? So there's lots of kind of reasonable disagreement about what counts as adequate. Or, if you wanted to focus on IRBs are supposed to avoid preventable harms to research participants, right? Well, what counts as preventable? What should the IRB have predicted, right? We know some people are going to be harmed by virtue of research participation because we don't know the answer, and that's why we're doing research. So those are things that would be hard to say, oh, there was an adverse event, and therefore we can attribute it to an IRB failure. So that kind of chain of logic makes it very difficult to evaluate IRBs. In general, it's also more difficult to assess preventative interventions because if the bad outcome doesn't occur, is it because you had the intervention, or is it just that the bad outcome would not have occurred? So in the IRB space, if bad things don't happen, is it because the researchers are putting out very ethical proposals and they know what, ethics requires of them now? Or is it because IRBs have made some change to the research to make it more ethically appropriate? Or is it just that the investigators know that they can't get away with things because the IRB is going to be looking over their shoulder? And so even though the IRB is not making any changes, the mere fact of their existence helps to advance ethical oversight, right? So those are some of the challenges just in evaluating IRBs as a preventative approach. Lots of confounders, and generally speaking, IRBs are tough to study, right? Tough to kind of open the door so you can evaluate their practices. And the result of all of these challenges is not that we have said, well, IRB quality is hard to measure, and therefore we're just going to throw up our hands and say it can't be done. Instead, we have measured what we are capable of measuring, which is predominantly whether IRBs achieve regulatory compliance and how quickly they turn their protocols back around to investigators. We have to follow the law, of course, right? IRBs must be compliant with the regulations. But that's not what they were created for, right? They were created to make sure that we are adequately protecting research participants. And so I really love this image, right? Because it helps us understand that if we are if the target, right, becomes what we're measuring. Excuse me, I reverse that. If the measure becomes the target, it's no longer a good measure, right? If we're just focused on complying with the regulations and how quickly we turn things around, we're not actually evaluating whether we are doing a good job protecting research participants, and it shifts the whole model, right? And then we risk losing some of the benefits that IRBs were supposed to achieve, and it becomes kind of all burden. The risk, right, that I really am worried about here is that we're creating a race to the bottom where we say, what's the bare minimum that an IRB should do, right? What's the bare minimum that they can request from researchers to make sure that the research is compliant? Barbara mentioned this, right? There's lots of gaps in the regulations, both in terms of things that are just not covered at all and things about which there's reasonable disagreement about how you should achieve them, with some kind of on the lower end of the spectrum and some on the higher end of the spectrum in terms of what would best promote ethical research. And so if we're just saying, look, all you have to do is follow the rules and we want to get this out the door as quickly as possible, we risk abandoning the ethical mission that IRBs were created to advance. So all of this doom and gloom, right? If we don't know how to evaluate IRB quality, then it's very hard to know whether they are doing a good job, like whether any IRB is doing a good job or whether the IRB system as a whole is doing a good job. It becomes hard to compare them across categories, right? So Barbara mentioned these different types of IRBs. We see a major push, right, with more research moving into the for-profit IRB oversight space. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? It's very hard to say empirically if we don't know how to evaluate those two different types of boards. And it becomes very difficult to demonstrate value in face of threats to the IRB. And I'll talk about some of those in just a minute. Now, just a brief flag that the organization that Melissa mentioned at the beginning that I co-lead with my colleague Holly Taylor is called the Consortium to Advance Effective Research Ethics Oversight, or the AREO Consortium, and we are trying to tackle this challenge of how do we do a good job evaluating IRB quality. And the key thing to keep in mind is because IRBs apply discretionary standards that require their judgment, it's very unusual that we're going to be able to get a helpful answer if we just ask, did the IRB get it right? Because people might reasonably disagree outside of egregious circumstances whether or not they got it right. There could be lots of acceptable answers. In the law, we deal with this all the time, right? In the context of medical malpractice or accommodation for disability, we ask, is it reasonable? And we think we might be able to do something similar with IRBs to say, what are the markers of reasonableness? For example, how well does the IRB engage with participant communities to understand what they want? How expert is the IRB? Are they engaged in high quality deliberation? Are they learning from their previous decisions, right, through a system of precedent? These would all be markers of IRB reasonableness. So that's the direction that we are pushing in. But I want to share some of the challenges that I have faced when talking to reporters, especially in the past couple of months, where they've asked questions like, with all of the changes and concerns about loss of funding to research institutions, what is the big deal if IRBs fail? I mean, they ask it in a little bit of a nicer way than that, but why would we care and how would we know if there was a problem here? And really what they're looking for in many cases is for me to say, we're going to have, the next Tuskegee, right? That gets thrown around a lot as a potential concern. And I'm not sure that we're going to go that far or that we should only be justifying IRB oversight through concern about those really egregious examples. The struggle, right, for people who are not in this world is that IRB failure might be very hard for any of us to see on a case-by-case basis. So if the consent is inadequate, the research participants are not necessarily going to know. It's hard to get your hands on consent forms if you're not part of the study to evaluate them. And so we might not see that if no one is harmed in an egregious way in the study and claims they didn't know what was going to happen to them. If the IRB did a bad job evaluating the risks and benefits, but generally speaking, people are okay, that might not come to light. Conflicts might go unnoticed, right? The participants are not going to be in a position to catch these failures, right? That's why we have the IRB in the first place. The investigators believe that their work is ethical or they wouldn't be doing it. And so it might take a whistleblower or some kind of investigative journalism, or you might not see these things until the studies get published. And even then, we might have some disagreement about whether the IRB actually failed, right? So it becomes quite difficult to prove the importance of IRBs. My pitch, though, and my claim is that doesn't mean IRB oversight isn't needed, right? If we reduce our ability to make sure that the research that's coming out of our institutions is ethical, then our standards might fall over time, right? The norms that we have built in around research ethics might fade. People might have less concern about getting caught, might not be thinking through things as carefully. And so it could be kind of a long downward slide. We would miss opportunities to address novel ethical challenges. And if there are, poor research ethics outcomes, then we might degrade trustworthiness in the research enterprise. So the opportunity for institutions is to really clarify what's at stake. And let's all think carefully about how we would answer the reporter's question or any member of the public. Why do we need IRBs and how do we know that they're helping improve research oversight? Find ways to demonstrate that value. And then really just to underscore what Barbara was saying, refocus on the IRB's true purpose, focus on the ethics as the most important thing, and that should take care of the compliance. Don't focus on compliance and that kind of bureaucratic box checking first. And then ideally, we might be able to improve trust in the research enterprise if we can promote awareness of IRBs amongst the public. It might be helpful for more people to understand that there is this independent group of experts that is overseeing research before you're even asked to take part in it. So I want to move quickly to make sure that we have time for questions. So I'll wrap up briefly, but I wanted to pick up the thread that Christine had started with. Just over the past year, some of the major changes we've seen. So obviously this concern about what's going to happen with indirects. The Secretary's Advisory Committee for Human Research Protections was disbanded. We saw major changes at the Office of Human Research Protections at HHS as a result of the RIFs and other changes. And then just in the past couple of weeks, the FDA commissioner was quoted as talking about his desire to streamline IRB regulations and reduce the number of questions asked by IRBs during review. And I just think that's such an important example of the kind of scapegoating that happens. IRBs are blamed for all sorts of delays in research. I can share this with participants. It's some comments that Aereo and others in the research oversight space made in response to some of these changes, flagging some of the implications for IRB oversight, some of the concerning implications. So one, right, Christine mentioned that indirect costs cover all sorts of things that are important to research infrastructure, including IRBs within institutions, right? And so IRBs, if institutions have less money to support their IRBs, that's not going to change IRB's obligations, right? They still have to make sure that they're complying with the regulations, and they still have to make sure that ethical research is coming out of their institutions. And so if there are fewer resources, we're going to see bottlenecks, less efficiency, and delay. And part of how that's going to come to the fore is that you're going to have fewer IRB staff who are able to guide investigators before they submit their protocols, and that will result in additional delay. We might, see fewer extras in the sense of, some human research protection programs have really strong educational programs for their institutions, helping researchers figure out how to improve their consents, engaging with communities to understand what they want to see out of research oversight. And there's just generally, right, the fewer resources we have and the fewer people that we have reviewing research, there's a greater risk of missing something important. I'm going to just go quickly over this, right? So the entity responsible for enforcing the common rule has over a long period of time been whittled down to nearly nothing. And the result is reduced capacity for enforcement and reduced guidance and education. And what that might counterintuitively mean is that when institutions don't know exactly what's required from a regulatory or ethics perspective, they might err on the side of caution, and we could see even greater conservative approaches that could inhibit research. So what should institutions do? I hope many of you on this call are able to take some of these steps. Make sure you understand what the IRB does and don't push them to do the bare minimum. Preserve as many resources for the IRB office as you can so that you can support their efforts to advance ethical research. And, to the extent possible, right, lobby those in power to restore federal oversight and guidance for ethical research. The last thing I'll share before closing is just some of these pressures associated with resources available for IRB oversight are likely to coincide with the push to AIify everything, right? And so we're starting to see lots of questions about, can't AI do it, right? Whatever, fill in the blank. So can't AI just stand in for the role of IRBs? And I think it's important to figure out, in a critical analysis approach, what is it that AI could do that could help IRBs do a better job without subbing for the kind of careful human ethical analysis that's required for oversight of research. So I'll point you to this resource, a fabulous essay by some Aereo colleagues and others, really doing exactly what I just described, analyzing ways in which IRBs could benefit from AI technology and what ought to be avoided. And I'll just kind of flag here, can be quite helpful, I think, for pre-screening applications to make sure that they're ready for prime time, like ready to be reviewed by the IRB. Can serve as a starting point for IRB review, but we want to be careful about de-skilling, right? And making sure that the humans still have practice and don't over-rely on AI, and some other kinds of decision support. So this is my last
perfect.
slide. Oh yeah, I'm done.
Okay, sorry. Just there's so many questions. They're great questions.
Yeah. Okay. This was it. So you can see what's on the slide here for a moment. I think the key thing is just making sure that we're all able to clearly explain why IRB oversight is essential without analogizing everything to Tuskegee.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Sorry to interrupt. I think there's so much that we can be talking about these two subjects in the subject matter. So I appreciate that. So I think what's important is, as I'm watching these questions come in, I think so much of the time the IRB becomes our punching bag. And I thought someone's comment in the Q&A said IRBs encompassed a people, and I think we have to remember that in considering themes, in that these are just people and who are part of our team, and being able to go to them, I think is really can humanize the conversation around what IRB does. Many of the questions that came up, I think, really goes back to Dr. Beer's comments about, our massive shift towards commercial IRBs, in which now 92% of pharma studies are done through these centralized IRBs. So with this happening, are they destined to only, our local IRBs, are they destined only to handle minimal risk or non-sponsored social studies? And what's going to happen with these? And are there ethical considerations with if we are basically having a centralized IRB approve as well as a local IRB?
So the stat comes from the statistic, which it comes from the GAO report. And I left it in the discussion, but my sense is probably surprising to most people, which is that the pharma studies are pretty sort of crystal clear what they do. It's well mapped. There are thousands or hundreds every year. They care about data integrity. They care that they don't put themselves at reputational risk. At least in the US, this is certainly part of the motivating factor. And yes, it's problematic, but I think the greater risks are with people that are less familiar with creating protocols that are interventional, or the ones that have risk with SBER research and other kinds of research, where the risks are not simply medical AEs and understanding. There's a pretty basic formula for a lot of these studies. I think they can be improved, but I don't think that's where some of the problems exist.
Yeah, can I just weigh in on that as well?
You're going to disagree, I'm sure, but
no, not necessarily. I mean, I think, look, there are other countries around the world that have, a single government body, right, that is reviewing research. And so I think we have many questions that are bound up in that single question, right, which is, what's the better model, right? Having like one unified national system versus many local IRBs. And then what's the proper role for private for-profit entities to be doing these reviews versus, nonprofit entities or entities that are housed within the research institution. Like I said, there's pros and cons to both. One of my concerns sometimes when we talk about private for-profit IRBs is the conflicts of interest, right? Are you paying for review? Sure, right? I think those conflicts are legitimate and real, but they have ways of, managing them. We also have to acknowledge that there are conflicts within university IRBs. It's not like Penn doesn't need all of its researchers to get funding and, to have those studies go through. It's just a different model. And if we had a better way of saying this is success, then we would be able to more easily evaluate their comparative risks and benefits.
And I was going to come back to that. The problem is we don't know how they're doing. Yeah. And specifically, we don't have a way of evaluating what they're missing because we only see what we see.
That's right.
A point Holly made. Yeah.
I think we have, unfortunately. Oh, go ahead.
I just wanted to say the one thing that is true about having an institutional IRB is that it's much more about the human research protection program at the institution, and we have let these fuse too much. That the IRB office is the whipping child for everything, even though it's not the IRB necessarily. And the HRPP, if the IRBs start to attenuate, the HRPP has to get stronger in ways that are significant. That is anyway an institutional responsibility. But we've done such a bad job of saying this is just a component. IRB, board is just a component of what you do to protect, participants in the research in which you do it, which does not
Melissa,
go away in a single IRB. Sorry.
I know you keep you need us to stop, but I just want to make sure that everyone's clear on this statistic. In the GAO report, my understanding is that in 2021 there was a crossing, right, where the independent IRBs were responsible for more oversight of FDA funded FDA regulated research than the university IRBs. But I'm not seeing the 92% number. It's that. We can look it up, but I think independent IRBs in 2020 were responsible for about half of the FDA regulated research. Okay. So the 92% we'll need to verify. I just don't want people to walk away thinking it's more than it is.
Okay, yeah. We'll make sure we get that in there.
Figure that out.
Yeah,
sorry.
Exactly.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you so much. I appreciate both of you as speakers. That was a fantastic, and we could have gone on. And so we will now take a 15-minute break, resuming at 11:30 Central Standard Time for the next session, which is ensuring research integrity in a changing environment. What standards and oversight will advance trustworthy science, to be moderated by Dr. Kimberly Kirkpatrick. So I appreciate all of your attention and returning at 11:30.